Okay, folks, a subject came up that is kind of interesting to me, and I'm really glad somebody asked about it, and that's called the Fiador. And the Fiador, I'm going to explain to you what I know about it and the way I see it. Back in the day, and I'm going to say ever since the hackamore was used, the horses were started at an older age, and they were started differently. And so the Fiador knot was designed to basically balance the hackamore, and I'll show you what balance means. When you lift up a hackamore, that's the contact. When you let go of it, that's the drop. Okay, a Fiador holds it halfway in between and balances it so that when you do pick it up, it's just a slight movement and you're in contact. Okay. The thing about the history of it goes that I know of, some of it I got from my great uncle that I've told you about, Uncle Bob. He cowboyed in Montana before World War I. And they used hackamores, which is the whole setup. But when they used them, they were 5-year-old horses minimum, and they put them right up about this high. And this is a 10.5-inch bosal. And the minimum back in them days was 12 inches. And they were usually a 1 inch. And they weren't as smooth as this. They were a greener hide. All of that stuff had a reason, because these horses were tough. And they bucked. Okay, so what they did was they'd put this big hackamore on there. And it had the Fiador, which came down and tied off here, and then connected to the hackamore and held it in place. Well, as it turns out, this knot right here is what's on the bottom of the Fiador. When I was a kid, I used a hackamore to start colts when I was in high school, and incidentally had no idea what I was doing. So there's 4 strands coming out of there, and what they did was this knot was down here, and then it went around the heel knot, the heel of the hackamore, and then these 4 strands were a really intricate set of knots that went up solid. And it was, I don't know what knot it was. You're going to have to get somebody like Bruce Sandiford. He's a lot savvier on these knots than I am. But anyway, this was on the bottom, and then there was this solid 4-strand knots going all the way up to here, and then it split, and the one on the right that went over the head had a loop on it. And so it went all the way around the neck and and connected to the headstone, came back here, and the one on the left was the 2 strands, and they stuck that through the loop, and that's how they tied it off. Okay, that kept the hackamore in place, because it was not like they are today. You had to have it solid on the horse's head to make it work. Now, as far as riding went, the way I understood it was that you could take a macate and have this below your bosal and run it through these loops, and then back up around the neck and tie a bowline. Now you still got 20 feet of macate, and they could tie it off to they used to take the wheels off the wagons in the spring and lay them in the mud and the soft ground in the spring, and they'd tie the other end off to the wagon wheel. Bronco would take off running, hit the end, and flip them. And incidentally, this was real. This was what really happened. There were no futurities. Okay, so then they get the horse gathered back up, and they've already roped it, as you know, to get it branded and castrated and all that, so it's been roped. Anyway, that was part of the theory of starting them, was to get them sore-headed, so that hopefully when they started to buck, you could bump them up. Some of them, it just made them madder. But the other thing that happened was, because of this being under here, some guys would take a cotton rope, and they would have how many ever feet it took, and they would have a piece this long that was just the twisted cotton rope. Then they would tie a knot here and here and unravel the rest, and then re-braid it. so it was a 3-strand braid. That gave them a flat rein. So as you can appreciate, it turned out to be 2 reins, split reins. They'd run that good part of the rope through there and then put the split reins through it, which gave them a cotton rope flat rein in each hand. It wasn't set up like we do the California style. And a lot of bronc riders, cowboys, they liked having those 2 separate reins. And like when I was around rodeo, another thing I failed at, a lot of guys called it a hack rein. Well, now they call it a bronc rein, I think. But anyway, it was connected to the hackamore. And the other way of doing it was to use these same loops, and then they would take their lines off of a harness. And the lines on a lot of the big work teams were real wide. They were like 1.5 inches, a full inch. And they would hook them up to the underneath here. And then they could use a leather rein one in each hand. And they got pretty darn good with them. It worked. It made a lot of sense. And then I think one of the reasons was because if you take a cotton rope and didn't braid it, it would be too slick and burn through your hand. And also, when you did actually get a bronco started long enough to rope on him, you could hold the coils in your hand and still be able to rope. So what I'm getting at is the Fiador was used on the early days with big hackamores, big horses, and it did 2 things. It kept it on their head and it balanced the bosal. So if you want to get a better explanation, or at least a different one, just get a hold of Bruce and he'll tell you his theory on it, because he uses them. I don't, because my hackamores are 1/3 the weight they were way back when, and they're not as long. And when I was in Bishop, California at the museum, I saw a bosal that was 16 inches long. And it was crude. In other words, it was 100 years old at least, and the strands were, you could almost see through it because the strands were so stiff and wide, and they weren't edged. Well, they did that on purpose. Well, this is an art form here. Back then it was called survival. So the Fiador has quite a history behind it, but the intricate knots are what's always impressed me as a kid. So for the folks that called in about that, that's the story on it. And somebody mentioned the silver concho on the forehead of a bosal. You know, there's a bosalito that you can hook here and then put it around the ears for an underbridle, which is because then you don't have all that bulk going under the bridle, and it's kind of a classy looking deal. But for me personally, on my old bridle horse, I had the silver conchos. It's called a faceplate. And they graduated down the face, and that was out of respect for the Camarillo family in California. And incidentally, there's a pretty strong connection between the Camarillo family and Battle Mountain, Nevada, if you want to know a little trivia. This headstall, I made it because it's old school, and these spots go back to the fancy harness days once again. The harness makers made saddles, bridles, and harness, especially from Missouri East. So they already had all these spots, and they'd put brass spots or silver spots. When you have a horse with a head like this, you really need to get something pretty on it. So that's the story on the Fiador. Okay, folks, I'd have to elaborate according to my bride. I made this, and the faceplate that goes down the front, you make it. You don't buy it. There's no faceplate store that I know of. And a couple people have asked where I get my hat. Well, I'll share a big secret with you. I get my hat at a hat store. Thank you. Goodbye.